Well, good afternoon and welcome to day one of Canadian Women in Cybersecurity, the post-lunch afternoon session. My name is Ali Hirji and most of you know me as the host of the Power Hour, but also faculty at Durham College in both AI and in cybersecurity. Happy International Women's Day. The theme for this year is Choose to Challenge. So I've made it a priority for myself to pick on one challenge and discuss it in every session that I'm going to be moderating. I have one session per day, rather two today and then one per day going forward, and I'm going to pick on one particular challenge. For me, as a male, recognizing that position as well, when I think about choose to challenge, I think about the privilege that I have to merely even choose that very challenge. Because of a lot of my colleagues, women, two-spirited, or other folks, don't necessarily have a choice in what they want to challenge. They're simply thrust into that position. So I recognize and identify my privilege and thank you for taking the time to join this very important conference, not just in the history of cybersecurity, but in the Canadian context as well. Today we're going to be talking about hiring. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Specifically, looking at how hiring practices have been impacted as a result of the pandemic. From the perspective of the good, we'll be looking at what has the pandemic forced us into doing. Some good practices that we could have adopted previously, but now really didn't have a choice and had to adopt. The bad? Well, besides looking at the realities of the economy, how has the hyper-virtual environments that we're in right now impacted the hiring space from a negative standpoint? And the ugly, neither good nor bad, what are some of those challenges that have emerged as a result of this? The pace at which hiring had to shift, that moment when we had to all go hyper-virtual, what did that do to the hiring and recruitment space? And we'll nestle all of this within a context of hiring doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's leadership that's a part of it. There's mentorship that's a part of it. And in this session brought to you by Phelps Cybersecurity, we'll be focusing on that contextual reality of hiring in cybersecurity during COVID-19. You've often heard me say this before, that talent will help you win a couple of games, but it's teamwork that'll get you the championships. And the team that I have on this panel today will certainly get us to the championship space of what needs to be done when you're thinking about hiring. So shout out to Phelps Cybersecurity for making this session happen. And I'm going to take the opportunity now to greet and welcome Heather, Esther, and Jill to this panel. Heather, let's begin with you. Firstly, thank you for taking the time. Happy International Women's Day. Can you introduce yourself, the firm that you work with, and tell us one thing about the hiring space that truly excites you? Heather?
Thank you, Ali. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And really, there's no other place I'd like to be right now, other than in person, obviously. But I can't think of a better way to celebrate IWD. It's hard to believe it was a year ago when I attended this conference in person at the West End. It was buzzing with mostly women, some men. There was so much energy and excitement in the room. So I'll imagine the same audience is here today with us, and I'm looking forward to a lively conversation. I represent Phelps Group. I'm a managing partner at Phelps Group. We're an executive search firm and leadership advisory. We're celebrating 35 years this year, and we cover a wide range of industries, recruiting for leadership roles in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors. Our firm thrives on working in evolving professions such as cybersecurity, which has become a specialty practice area within our firm over the past number of years. What I really love about the work we do is that we have the opportunity to listen to real stories every day from candidates and organizations. And from this, we learn about what is unique to each person and organization. We really have an opportunity to make a meaningful impact by guiding people through a critical juncture in their lives, impacting their career, the organization's direction, and outcomes. We embrace the fast pace, the agility, the ability to pivot quickly, continuous learning, and evolving that comes with a profession like cybersecurity.
All right.
So I
And Heather,
turn it
if
over
I
to
can
you,
just
Alex.
work with that very quickly, I think that last line that you said around education and learning, I've said this many times that don't let your education come in the way. If you're learning, you're constantly learning. And I really want to jump into those pieces of the mentorship and training programs that Phelps has been focusing on as well. I also want to thank you for not just attending the in-person Canadian Women in Cybersecurity last year, but for continuing that conversation. Nothing hurts more than untold stories, and you will continuously allow for spaces for stories to be told. So thank you for that, and I think it's really fitting and an honor to have you here on International Women's Day. Esther, let's come over to you. Introduce yourself, the role that you play in your organization, and tell us something interesting about the work that you do when it comes to recruitment and your perspective. Esther?
Sure. Thank you, Ali. So I am the Vice President of Organizational Effectiveness and Human Resources at Fleming College in Peterborough. And I joined Fleming College last year through a virtual hiring process, which was a really different experience for me. And since then, I've hired lots of people virtually too, as we've mostly been in lockdown here for a good part of that time. I come, however, from the nuclear field, where I spent the last 8 out of 10 years in the Canadian nuclear industry, which, as you can imagine, has a really heavy focus on cybersecurity. So I was delighted to be invited to be part of this panel today. What I find the most interesting about hiring, whether it's in the virtual world or in the real world, is it's got some risk to it for both the candidate and the organization. And there is nothing cooler than when you get a really good fit, and there's little worse than when you don't. And it's a bit of an art, and it's a bit of a science, and it is. I've been doing it for more years than I care to mention, and it never gets old. It's always fresh.
Absolutely. The clock always refreshes at the end of the day, and I know that there's much to learn in each day. And I really want to tie into that piece of mentioning that your current role, you were hired in a virtual environment. How would that have been different if it was not virtual? And that's surely a question that we're going to get to as we go through this session. Esther, once again, it's a pleasure. I'm located in Oshawa, and it's not too far away from Peterborough, in the college sector as well. Fleming College does some fantastic work, and it's truly an honor to have another individual from the college sector here today for International Women's Day. And lastly but not the least, Jill, perhaps you may not recall this, but I remember you from my very early days when I worked at the Ontario Research and Innovation Optical Network, and we had shared some exchanges back then around some RFPs. It's a pleasure to come full circle and now be on a session and a panel with you. Introduce yourself, the work that you do, and how it ties into the Phelps team as well, and something that excites you about this space, especially in your role in leading leaders. Jill?
Thanks, Ali. Well, it's great to be here, and happy International Women's Day to everybody. It's great for us to gather and have a moment to reflect on all the great strides we've made and where we want to go. I support Phelps as their director of leadership. I also have a little company I run on the side called BirchGrove. And for the last 10 years, I've been studying all about how we learn to lead. I've looked at all kinds of different ways that leaders have been embracing all of the change that's happened in the pandemic. And you can imagine March 16th, about a year ago, really, we all had our antenna up as leaders. And what I'm really excited about getting involved in this panel today is really because I think there's an opportunity that we can start to think about what ways forward now from a leadership perspective, from a digital perspective, from a cybersecurity perspective. And to me, what's happening, Ali, is all of these things now are kind of interweaving together. one of the challenges we have as leaders is that we want to make sure that we've kind of got our hands on all of those levers. It's very difficult times right now. We tend to focus in, and things get lost along the way. So my hope today for the panel is that with all of my colleagues, that we'll be able to maybe provide a bit of a broader lens, some things that you can take away, because it's really important that you take pragmatic stuff away, and we'll try and be as practical as we can. So thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here today.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right when you say plans are good, but planning is everything. And to our audience, I'm sure when we engage with Jill, you'll begin to see that active element that she brings to the table around not just thinking about leadership, but how do we actually do leadership and how do we actually activate some of our plans within that. So Jill, Esther, Heather, thank you so much for that fabulous introduction. You've already given me a whole bunch of questions that I can come back at you with. We'll take that at a bit of a later time. Heather, let's set some context over here. The subject, good, bad, and ugly of hiring with COVID-19. And let's hit straight to the button of the topic, and that is, well, what is the good? What is the bad? And what is the ugly? From your perspective and years in the recruitment space, can you shed some perspective on this? Heather?
Absolutely, Ali. It's really a great question, and the last year has been such a tremendous pivot for all. So I'd like to start with a quote that states, "There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen." One would think this quote was current and the result of this past year, but it actually is a quote from 1917, Vladimir Lenin. The pandemic has really created disruption across industries, and leadership roles have dramatically shifted. Some competencies that were nice to have are now really must-haves in our new world. And yet on the flip side, some previous competencies are less of a priority now. As a Harvard Business article stated, the impact on work is far more profound than just changing where people work. It is also fundamentally altering what work is performed and how we perform it. So while we have been conducting interviews via video conferencing for the past number of years, this trend accelerated into high gear, really full throttle during COVID-19. And just like our clients, we pivoted, designing a completely virtual process to ensure continuity of searches. We learned with our clients, and together, I think we've created a process that's even stronger. And we've saved many trees, as this process compelled many selection committees to go paperless
Absolutely.
for the first time. Not to mention the time and money savings in respect to convening panels with no travel requirement. Our overarching goal has always been to ensure that not only is our client's journey rewarding, but that our candidate's journey is a positive experience. So we've really worked with our clients to customize a more creative and innovative search process where both clients and candidates can feel comfortable. Some of these processes include video conferencing. And we believe that post-pandemic, all initial interviews, even those with the selection committee, will likely stay video. Right now, through COVID, as Esther shedded some light on, we have seen some sight unseen hires in quite a few, actually. All of them have pretty much been sight unseen hires throughout the COVID time. Leveraging technology where possible. And we've developed an AI tool in conjunction with Ali's team at Durham College. It's a really great tool that works hand in hand with our human team to reduce biases during initial screening applications. Technologies like this are going to continue to grow, and we see opportunities where people are video interviewing. It's a critical piece of the whole process, and so we're seeing video resumes or intros being done live and sent in for submission on opportunities. AI-driven interview videos where candidates are recording their answers without a live person. And the digitization and virtual sharing of materials, including such things as candidate presentations, is likely to continue. Using online survey tools, live polls allows us to gain some continuous feedback. So we also find great value in this now. And we've been using virtual tours and presentations to provide our candidates with insights into what the organization looks like. We also have increased the use of psychometric leadership assessments. These are emotional intelligence tools as well that really help to round out the picture of candidates and help to shed more light on individuals when we don't get to see people in person. So the pandemic has really ushered this new acceptance for virtual meetings, and we can see many of these new practices continuing to emerge post-pandemic. Another good would be establishment of the Phelps Arty Board. It's our anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion board, which really helps to give us support in ensuring we bring the most diverse slate of candidates to the table during our shortlists and long lists. Phelps Advisory Board is representative of a community of diverse leaders, representative of Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ2S, and people with disabilities. And we're working together to advance opportunity for racial equity and inclusion throughout the executive search process and beyond. It's about creating an ecosystem for diversity and inclusion that is sustainable.
Yep.
One of the other areas as well is that we've had a ringside seat to ensuring competencies that are required during these unprecedented times are foregrounded in our process. Competencies like agility, empathy, virtual team leadership skills, the ability to demonstrate leadership in crisis. But by the same token, we are also screening leaders who can bring a sense of stability to teams. When teams are working remotely, we know mental health is at an all-time high, and people are feeling anxious in this state of constant change. This leads into the bad. We believe this technological adaptation will have a long-lasting impact on the executive search business and talent acquisition as a whole. We know that remote working and virtual meetings will continue, although less intensely than during the pandemic. And some may think this is bad, but we believe that the leadership coaching and development of leadership skills required to navigate in these times, that through this, people will continue to adapt and learn to embrace many of the benefits. One of the challenges that we hear over and over again is that both candidates and clients are struggling more to engage in this virtual world. Things like body language, energy, eye contact, and of course, those casual conversations that happen more easily in person, those water cooler conversations just aren't happening. And most leaders do present themselves better in person than through a computer monitor.
Absolutely.
So really there's this desire for face-to-face time when making such a critical life decision.
Yeah.
I have an ugly if you want to hear it.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so we're really working on bringing that humanity piece back into the process. And we feel that one of the uglies is the etiquette in virtual settings. So in chat rooms, side conversations tend to happen, private conversations between committee members. Sometimes there's videos that are being turned off, which we know need to happen at certain times. But as one candidate said to me, it feels like the paper bag syndrome. If I walked into a boardroom with a paper bag, would that be acceptable? So we're trying to navigate through these times. And, you know, there are moments where our technology doesn't work. And there's moments where, you know, all of these pieces can be the perfect storm. So we want to ensure we don't lose the integrity, really, of the interview process.
Heather, thank you for that. Very comprehensive and very thorough, where you've gone through multiple goods, couple of bads, and really summarized the ugly into one condensed argument there, which is a very good avenue for me now to bring Jill into the conversation and then Esther. Jill, you know, from a leadership perspective, especially when you look at Phelps and Phelps Cybersecurity as an offshoot, focusing on leadership roles within cybersecurity, how has the pandemic impacted leaders and how they present their candidacy? So when you think about, you know, a search isn't about, you know, what am I looking for? It's about what you're not looking for. How do leaders now navigate that space to sort of show what the recruiters are looking for and not what they're not looking for? Jill, your perspective.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ali. And I think there's a couple of things our audience will want to start thinking about if you're preparing for that next big interview. You know, if you're contemplating, even if you're, you know, presenting to media, wherever you are, you want to start thinking about the attributes that has changed as a result of the kind of shifts that we've had in leadership. So a lot of the things that we're looking at right now, to, you know, piggyback off what Heather was saying, is the term that we are using is pragmanity. And decision making has changed during the pandemic. I think we'd all agree on that we had to pivot very quickly. Decisions were made very, very fast, and we needed to be pragmatic. And now the added dimension that's happening is all of these decisions that we're making have to be made with a high degree of humanity. We know that there are people that are doing well during the pandemic, but we also know there are many, many groups that have been disenfranchised, that are not treated respectfully. And we have to be very sure that when we're doing furloughs or layoffs, that those individuals have that ability to bounce back up. So pragmaticity is an attribute that you want to think about as you evolve your leadership and how you begin to balance the tension between, those decisions that are coming at you, and ways now that you want to steward your organization and make sure that you're doing good by doing well. When we start thinking about another type of behavior, we want to start thinking about what are the kinds of skills that leaders need as they develop. And so I'm not only going to be asking you to think about new attributes and competencies that you want to develop, like activism, like advocacy, as we've talked about, but I'm also going to be asking you to think about when was the last time you really started thinking about the kind of scenarios that are in front of you. I've been asking organizations all over Canada in the last year, what kind of scenarios do you have developed right now? And they say to me, Jill, I'm too busy. I haven't had any time to do any scenario planning, which scares me to death. Because what we know right now is that strategy itself is being reinvented. So as a leader, you want to be up to speed on what are the latest things happening in strategy, but with an eye to what are the 4 or 5 scenarios that may emerge that I better bob and weave for, and what kinds of things do I need to do? Now, from a cybersecurity perspective, we know that digital has been the amazing savior in the pandemic. The ability that we've had to be protected, that we've been able to create systems and processes. And so the challenge again is going to be to get up the curve as fast as you can on those changes and be able to incorporate them when you're in your interview process, laced with examples and statistics that really demonstrate to the recruiter that you're right on the button, that you know what's happening. And it's interesting, I was looking at a study today, Ali, and they were saying that 42% of organizations that were surveyed by McKinsey has said that their competitive advantage was up 28% if they moved quickly. Yep. And so this notion of boldness, and this is a tough one, isn't it? Because we're all kind of navigating in the land of the unknown. And how do I be bold and also measured at the same time? Yeah. And so this is, again, if I was going to give a word or a phrase, Ali, to sum this up, we really have to be walking the tightrope as you think about what does this leadership look like? Walk that tightrope, make sure you've got a strong core, because we know when you're walking a tightrope, boy, you need a strong core and you need to get your balance. And so we're going to be talking about mentorship later on, and we'll get to that. But those are just some early thoughts in that area.
Yeah, no, and I think you've done a fascinating job. I mean, working off with what Heather said, which was looking at it from a recruiter's perspective. But now, Jill, you really shed light on the candidate themselves, especially leaders in cybersecurity who are trying to get into, let's say, a new role or managing their own role right now and looking at some of the pivots. I've often made the statement that, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. Right now, we have this practice where we need to go far and we need to go fast. How do you manage to strike that balance? And speaking of that balance, Esther, this is a perfect way to bring you back into the conversation, especially with the introduction that you made about you yourself having gone through a virtual interview to land the position that you are in right now. From your perspective, what have some of the challenges been with going entirely virtual to present a pretty impressive candidacy such as your own? Esther?
Yeah, that's a great question that, all of us are facing these days. So I think one of the key challenges is, how do you establish rapport over a screen? You're looking at people in 2 dimensions. I think back now, and there are like 6 or 8 people on my screen, and I don't even remember who all was there for my interview. And so, there's like a transactional piece of things like, in an interview, set your Zoom setting or whatever platform you're using so that it's the speaker who is filling up your screen, so that, you can kind of make eye contact. So there's those kinds of things. But, for me, it kind of starts with, you really need to ground yourself. And at the end of the day, a video interview is not that different from an in-person interview. It's only as different as we think of it as being different. And so if I set myself up for, okay, so I'm meeting with these 6 people, I'm going to have to establish rapport just as I would if we were in a boardroom. The good news is they're not judging me on, how I walk into the room or the firmness of my handshake or all the silly things that people still, even in 2021, still make these assumptions about other people, right? And so, it's a bit of a clean slate. How do I present myself in a really authentic way? How do I, not even if I've made notes, how do I not be reading from my notes visibly? How do I spark that connection? And the reality is, if I can't do that in an interview, I'm not going to be able to do that in the workplace. And so that's something that I would encourage people to practice. If you've got an interview coming up, enlist a friend. Do a practice Zoom interview. It doesn't even matter what the questions are. You don't need, the technical questions. You just need to practice connecting with someone who'll give you the feedback of, yeah, no, I don't feel you, or yeah, that was great. I felt like we were in the same room together.
Absolutely, and I really appreciate the fact that you also brought up the element of what and I guess it sheds light on the good that has come out of this, is that we started to now identify some of those biases that would come up when we would be in person. And this virtual environment has allowed us to not just interrogate those biases, but completely break them at their core. So really very good start for us here from Heather all the way to Jill, building on what Heather said and looking at the leadership aspects. And now Esther drilling a little bit more deeper into the actual exchange that happens. To our audience that's watching on cyberexchange.ca, I know we've got quite a few viewers that are on. You'll notice that while you're enjoying this session, there's a little ticker below there. I encourage you, if you get the chance, to go and check out phelpscybersecurity.com, or just even look at some of the different assets that the Phelps Group has put out there in terms of readings that are related to this topic that you can reflect on. Even follow them on social media. You'll get a few nuggets of advice that I think would really help you over and above this session alone. Going back to the conversation now, Heather, a question has come in which is actually directly sort of targeted at the Phelps Group. So I'll read it out verbatim because I think it plays on a conversation that you had towards the end around the emphasis around cybersecurity. You've heard me say this a lot of times, that security always ends up being like it's too much until it's not enough. And we often find ourselves talking too much about cybersecurity, but then we need to actually do something about it. The Phelps Group has now started a specific practice in cybersecurity. Heather, why cybersecurity specifically?
Thanks, Ali. I think one of the big reasons is really it's an industry that is very much evolving, and it's an industry that has been continuing to pivot and continuing to demonstrate agility. These are all traits that we as our leadership team actually at Phelps exhibit and thrive in this type of an environment. I think one of the key pieces for me is that when you look at the statistics around gender parity in cybersecurity, in 2020, we're still only at 20% women representation. That's a big gap, and we need to continue to address this. So personally for me, it's a piece around continuing to mentor and propel women in cybersecurity forward.
Absolutely. And if I can just work with that just a little bit more, it's a bold step that you've taken, and you at the helm of it alongside Jason and the rest of your team. But as I've said this to many folks, if you want to sail far, you got to start losing sight of the shore sometimes. That safety net that we have, that valve that we have, we need to go above and beyond that. So I do commend you again for challenging yourselves at the Phelps Group and going that extra level. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those challenges as well with setting up a cybersecurity hiring practice. And in that note, I'm going to bring Jill and Esther then back into the conversation. Jill, from a leadership perspective, especially leaders in cybersecurity, one of the things, and it's a question that's also come in, is that yes, you could be hiring, and I'll reword this, thank you to whoever sent that question, I'll reword this just a little bit, is that you could be hiring leaders for very specific roles in cybersecurity itself. But there's also the flip side of this, is where leaders are now, because of the hyper virtual world we find ourselves in, as Heather beautifully put about the decades and weeks example, in 2 months, we've seen 3 years worth of innovation. Now, even if you're not hiring for a cybersecurity leadership role, leaders in general are expected to be fluent and congruent in cybersecurity speak. What are some tips that you would suggest to leaders to get up to date with this rapidly changing environment? Jill?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, Ali, as I work with leaders, one of the qualities I like to ask some pretty innocent questions. How do you learn? How do you learn to lead? And, the answers that you get back tend to really resonate around being voracious, around taking in information and having external focus. So it's a challenge, right? Because we're all super busy. Everybody's got their head down. And what we need to now start to think about doing is carving out time in your schedule to start getting your antenna up, to start making those connections into the network. So you're at this conference right now. So what I would want to do if I were you in the audience is look at all of the topics, look at all of the speakers that you see in front of you for the next few days, and start to laser in on areas that you're not too clear about. Try and find individuals that are speaking that will maybe have a conversation or a cup of coffee, virtual cup of coffee with you to talk about their area of expertise. And it's becoming what I call the dangerous expert. And what do I mean by that? A lot of times when we're working in various roles, and the higher you get up in the organization, of course, the more you're having people issues than perhaps technical issues. And that's one of the issues that I think that, Heather and Esther have hit on, is this whole need to think about, how are you going to start to begin to really move your team forward? And we want to be able to know enough information. So to your question, that you can start framing how questions. And so this is one of the things that leaders are now doing, is framing questions of how do I become more adept at working with my team in a crisis? How do I, when you ask those kinds of questions, you're going to start to see patterns of your own leadership evolve. And this is really important, because when Heather is looking at you eye to eye, when you're in that interview situation, you know what she's going to say is, tell me about a time when. Or can you please share an example when? And you want to say, yes, Heather, I can tell you here's an example. I was at this cybersecurity conference. I reached out to Ali. We had a 3-hour conversation on the future of cyber, and I learned the following 3 things. And so messaging yourself up is also very important. When Esther was talking about being present with a friend, if you're going for an interview, also think about practicing the kinds of messaging and communication, the kinds of eye contact that you can make and bring your presentation alive. Using some fun visuals is also a really great way to do that, and breaking those silos down so that people are comfortable. Because we're in an artificial world right now, aren't we? We're all sort of in a bit of a fishbowl. And so the more comfortable and real that you can be, the more that will carry you far. So voraciously read, connect like crazy. This is one of the big issues that I've found in my research, is that people are now really starting to move outward from their organization. They know what they did during the pandemic, but now they want to understand, what are the best practices that everybody else started to deploy? And how can we begin to create a body of knowledge around that? So one of the things I hope this conference does is to help build that body of common knowledge where you can start to draw from it. So just a couple of ideas there.
No, absolutely. I think that is fantastic. And more importantly than that, you've also set a few KPIs. I know we've got quite a few C-suite executives that are listening right now. These were some very good KPIs that you can put onto a scoreboard and start to measure yourself against. I also really paid attention, Jill, to the fact that you kept talking about the us in the team. It's not just, when it comes to cybersecurity and leaders, it's not just, you have to do this to respond to this incident. Let us do this to respond to this particular incident. And being a part of the team, I think you've emphasized that so really well. So thank you for that. And to the group, everybody that's listening rather, Jill's contact details are, Jill's on the platform as well. You can connect with her, available through the Phelps team as well. Highly, highly recommend that if you want to explore these KPIs further, you reach out and engage with her even further. Esther, working on what, and one more thing, Jill, you mentioned interviews, which I'm going to bring back to Heather just after involving Esther in this little conversation. I'm seeing some chat that's going around, yes, there's cybersecurity hiring, but cybersecurity hiring doesn't happen in a vacuum like most hiring. There's context, and one of the most powerful aspects of context is different sectors. Now, Esther, you've seen different sectors, the energy sector, and now you're in public sector, academe. Have you seen, or can you comment a little bit on some shifts that you've seen in hiring practices between different sectors, Esther?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that it's a sector question so much as it is the world is evolving at this rapid pace.
Yeah.
And, now is actually this phenomenal time for women in cybersecurity because so many of us are looking at our equity, diversity, and inclusion stats.
Yep.
And we're actually appalled that despite all of the effort for decades that we've been making, we look at our cybersecurity teams and they're primarily male. And so, good time to be a woman in cybersecurity. I think the other shift that is happening is employers are starting to hire more for potential or with a heavier focus on potential. So I look at it this way. There's often a candidate who doesn't have exactly the set of skills and experience that I am looking for a particular role, but they've got a great attitude. They've got that voracious curiosity that Jill was talking about. They've got a network of people who, frankly, they reach out to for answers to questions and ideas. I'm looking for that attitude and motivation because I'm going to have to train someone anyway on, my way of doing things in my organization. I want to invest in someone who, is the candidate who stands out from all of the interviews because they're already investing in themselves. So if they don't have all of the technology that I'm looking for example, they're reading something or they're, doing an online course or, they're doing something to show that I should invest in them, that they've got the attitude and the motivation that I can't, I can influence, but I can't change. I can help them acquire hard skills. I can't help people acquire attitude. And so it's that attitude that needs to come through in interviews. And I've seen that across all of the sectors in which I've worked, including both across the private and the public sector over the last, few years.
Esther, I couldn't agree with you more. And just if I can take 30 seconds and just relate what you've said to CISO Forum 2020. One of the award winners, I think it was the Lifetime Achievement Award, or there were 3 awards at CISO Forum. And one of the awards went to Jamie Reese in New Brunswick, well-known CISO. And when he gave his acceptance speech, he said, and he was referencing this piece where you find a lot of people now and leaders in cybersecurity, even though they don't have technical trainings in cyber. But it's the power of showing up. They showed up to the conversation. They showed up to the conferences. They had those dialogues with security analysts all the way up to other CISOs and CIOs, so on and so forth. And now they can speak that language. They can speak that strategy. They may not be the ones able to, for example, run a Metasploit framework for you to run a pen test, but they sure as hell understand what the implications are of a test of that nature. So Esther, thank you for that, because you really said further light on the context around cybersecurity hiring. Speaking of context, Heather, let's jump a little bit into the interview side of things. Not only do I want to sort of delve into the types of questions that have now emerged as a result of the pandemic, I also want to flip that and say, hey, what kind of questions do candidates also need to start asking of the organizations choosing to hire them? Because an interview isn't just about the recruiter getting to know the candidate. It's also about the candidate getting to know the firm that they want to join. So can you shed some light on the changing landscape of interview questions on both sides, Heather?
Yes, absolutely, Ali. And, to your point about the awards, it was interesting to note that the nominated leaders were nominated really for their capabilities, their leadership qualities.
Yep.
So I think that's a nice segue for us to dive into a little bit on the questions that we ask, which tend to be quite behavioral, and they're really focused on addressing these capabilities. To Esther's point, it's about what are you capable of, not necessarily what you've done, but we are looking at that. What have you done? How does it relate? How does it align with the career opportunity? And really taking some time to explore lived experiences, those transferable competencies that may not be so necessarily easy to identify. And I think about an individual that I worked with who was from the military and had just come back from Afghanistan. His experience as a corporal in leadership was really phenomenal. He had stress management, second to none. His ability to manage through crisis, unbelievable. And when I look at his transferability into the civilian world, as they frame it, it was a real opportunity to explore that lived experience and how it's applicable and how it can be identifiable. But as a candidate, it's really important to call it out and to show that transferability to the clients. So I think that committees are really looking to gain insight through these behavioral questions into also the soft skills of leadership. Those pieces like communication skills, those abilities to influence, the empathy is critical, more critical than ever before. The hybrid team leadership model, technology smarts, of course, and VUCA-ability. So we actually are looking at, obviously operating in this VUCA world right now, which really, for those that aren't aware, VUCA-ability, and VUCA stands for the volatile, uncertainty, complex, and ambiguity times. So some of the questions that we see, Ali, are questions like, describe one of the largest change management transformation initiatives you've led a team through. What were those challenges that you faced? What was the action you took and the outcomes? And if you were to lead this initiative again, would you change anything about your approach? So notice the ORs. We call them the ORs. They're the opportunity, action, result. And we've tied an S in this because we're finding stakeholders are really critical as well. What was your involvement with? Who got involved? Who did you have to get buy-in with? And who did you have to partner with? So framing accomplishments in your behavioral answers is really helpful for the committee to really get a sense of the full scope. And we were looking for, in a question like this, how do you pull people together? How do you collaborate? How do you influence? How do you maybe co-create? And in this world, decision-making needs to be able to be made fast, as Jill was alluding to, much faster than ever before. Recent data, in fact, shows that decisions made on 80% data in the past, evidence-based decision-making as we call it. But since COVID, it has really changed to about 60 to 65% data. We're working in uncharted waters, no playbook, and we need to move fast. So this has always been a priority in cybersecurity. It's probably no new language for anyone in this world. So it's something that is a natural competency, I think, that many have already acquired in this space. So this rapid change really calls out that need for communication with candor, the honesty without ambiguity, that ability to really target communication to different purposes, target audiences. And it's a matter of really doing this in working through certainly the agility. One specific question that I think might be helpful for our audience today that we recently used in a director search for cybersecurity was, as the new director, you will be building a hybrid team of individuals reporting directly to you, individuals in other departments with a security mandate, and vendors embedded into your team. Tell us about a team that you have brought together in the past with a similar structure, and how did you build cohesion amongst the group? Similar in some ways, this question is to the previous one. So you need to have multiple examples of accomplishments to draw on, ways to really showcase your ability to gain trust within not only your team, but also departments across the organization. This is very important in cybersecurity, where it's influential leadership and it's working across the entire organization wide. That ability to foster strong, cohesive teams, is an ongoing concern, and it's because it's tied to also virtual and hybrid teams. As the Project Management Institute President and CEO, Sunil Prashara, warns, hybrid teams require a different style of leadership. If you just sit back and don't bring your virtual teams together regularly, work streams will fall apart.
Yep. Absolutely. And you know what, I think if I can build on that just a little bit, I had another individual in a leadership role in cybersecurity who had made reference to the fact that the process has changed dramatically. It's no longer that we're driving an automatic vehicle here. We're back to basically navigating with a stick. We're back to you have to sense the pulse of the organization. You've got to sense some of their concerns. You've got to sense, how is this all going to impact ROI? And as I like to call the ROI, it's not just the return on investment, it's the return on imagination. Being able to imagine how this organization can now imagine itself in this new reality that is basically going to become our permanent reality, which has one thing constant, and that is change. Speaking of change, I want to come back to Jill and then again to Esther and probably have a bit of a dialogue here around the changing face of mentorship and leaders. To teach us to learn, and that's one of my binding philosophies when I'm in the classroom, because as I'm teaching, I get to learn from my colleagues that are my students, but they're more like colleagues to me. In your perspective, Jill, leaders who are giving back through mentorship programs or want to give back through mentorship programs, what's changed now? And what are some tips that you can provide leaders who are not just looking to mentor others, but are also looking for mentors themselves? Jill?
Yeah, no, it's really, we're in interesting times, I think, in mentorship and coaching. And, just to make the distinction first for our audience between mentorship and coaching, a lot of people use the terms interchangeably. And while, it is an individual that's, giving a person support, when we start thinking about mentorship, it's more of an informal kind of relationship that's really based on connection, conversation, trust, experimentation. A formal coaching arrangement that you might have with somebody is more based on, as Heather was mentioning, developing the soft skills. And you'll indulge me, but the term soft skills drives me up the wall. If I was to say anything that emerged out of the pandemic is that soft skills are the new hard skill. And what we want to be able to do from a mentoring and coaching perspective is to really help mentees get themselves comfortable with navigating complexity in politics and all of the things that await you. Those of you who are working in large, complex national or international organizations, with what I speak. And what we want to be able to do is find someone that we can trust, someone that we can make a connection with, and someone that will really be able to make a difference in opening up our perspectives and how things are done. So this person doesn't have to necessarily have buckets of experience that they're sharing. They don't have to be 100 years old. You can reach out to somebody who's literally just new to the company and maybe a few months ahead of you, who can help you from stepping on those little mines that may happen as you progress in your career, when you're 3, 6, or if you're in the job for a year. So there's missteps that we want to make. And so the hardest thing about mentorship is starting. And if we were in an audience right now, I'd ask people to put their hands up. How many people here want to mentor? And I'd ask people, how many people here want to, get a mentor? And then we would start pairing people up. And so I hope with this conference that you're able to pair up together and start having conversations and, look to people that can really provide you with some strength, that can bring out your strengths. You want to find somebody that you can maybe confess a few things to, that I think I said something really bad in a meeting and I think I might have blown it, like I need to recover. What do I do? These kinds of things are so important. And of course, as you're trying to navigate in your career, one of the things we're certainly seeing is that it's much more of a lateral move that people are making now before they start making the moves up the chain. And so as you're starting to scope out, if you're in a large, complex organization, identifying different mentors for different stages of your career and who would help you at this moment. And maybe there's a few people that come into your mind, and don't be afraid to contact that person. Reach out to them. And you don't have to pick up the phone and say, hi, will you mentor me? You can just say, hi, I've been working on this project. Your name came up. Any chance we could have a coffee? And oftentimes that's how it all starts. It's just a little coffee. And then maybe you have another coffee, and then all of a sudden you have a relationship that, really starts to blossom, and that nice trust comes into play. The other thing before I turn it over to Esther is that I do want to make an impassioned plea for men to step up as mentors to women. And it's interesting. I don't know if anybody saw the Globe and Mail today, but they're just talking about the power of male mentors in a program that was launched in Australia 10 years ago, where they started off really trying to get men to help women. And that program now is all around the world. And there's 250 CEOs that are driving it across all these continents. And so we know that we can't do things alone. On International Women's Day, look right, look left, look up, look down, look everywhere you can to try and help support women to make those gains. And it's up to us to try and reach out, and it's up to you to try and reach in. And so having that balance between looking when somebody may be struggling and having that gentle tap, is there some help I can give you? Those kinds of things are so important right now. So Esther, over to you.
Yeah. And Esther, just before I bring you in, because there's actually a question that I want to weave into your response to Jill. And I also want to commend Jill, because Jill, you've really touched on the diversity element from an experience standpoint. I think that piece of, we now don't need to just be going to folks with buckets of experience, even people with droplets of experience, we can work with that because there are entire oceans of perspective there, especially with the pandemic. Most of us did not have a pandemic preparedness plan, so there's a lot of importance to go to folks who may have those few droplets that could be very useful for us. Jill, thank you for that. Esther, along with your response to Jill's perspective on mentorship and coaching, there's a question that's come in around, we have a society, or at least, and this is a general statement, but we tend to be very certification centric and accreditation centric. Do you think that the pandemic, especially now when we're presenting our skills, do you think the pandemic has kind of loosened the need for everybody to have a certification for every hard skill that they show on their application? Esther?
Yeah, so first, I'd just like to say I agree with everything that Jill said around mentorship and coaching. It's so important. And if I could just add one thing to that conversation, I would say don't wait for the formal organizational program to be rolled out. I often hear from young women in particular, "Oh, just wait, we need a mentorship program," and it's like, pick up the phone. It's okay to ask, and as Jill said, invite someone for a coffee, ask if you can pick their brains for 20 minutes, and then stick to that. On the certification, there really have always been two schools of thought on that. You either need certification for everything, or you know what, it's nice if you have it because it demonstrates that you're able to complete something, but beyond that, not necessary. As long as you have skills and experience and attitude. I'm not sure that the pandemic has changed that. I think people come at it from whatever their worldview is. And, we're still looking at a lot of the same people in hiring roles. And so what I would, offer to the women at this conference or to anyone is go after those certifications that either really call to you. I mean, it's something that you're genuinely interested in and not just something you're doing just because, or the ones that are table stakes in your chosen career path. You can't get very far without table stakes. And so you need to be able to discern, with the help perhaps of a mentor, what the table stakes certifications are and which are the nice to have, but could ultimately put you over the top in terms of, oh, here's someone who goes after kind of everything indiscriminately. It's partly around figuring out where you think you want your career to go. And that's not, the org chart box of the past, but it's the direction that you think you're heading in. So you don't need the unnecessary ones, but you do need the table stakes.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for that word direction. To our audience I believe it's at 2:30 p.m. You can check the schedule down below when you're watching live. I think at 2:30 p.m. we have the City of Toronto that's going to be learning a session that's actually called Speed with Direction. And how do you actually navigate a space of cybersecurity moving very fast, different demands on the city resources? How does the office of the CISO ensure that they're moving quick but within a defined direction? How to pivot as well. So I do recommend to our audience to take in that session, which should start at approximately 2:30 if I'm not mistaken. We've got another 7 minutes left, and there's a question that's come in which I am going to open up to anyone on this session, and that is, I didn't see this coming, so thank you for dropping this in there to whoever direct messaged it to me. And this is a question around boards of advisors. And a lot of leaders tend to be on different boards, and a lot of them right now are having to pay extra attention in those board meetings because difficult decisions are now having to be made. It's not just about, here, read the quarterly report and it looks good. Some very difficult decisions and action items binding the organizations have to be made. Can you shed a little bit of light around how the Phelps Group, or how in general you would recommend for leaders to start rethinking, or what other skill sets do you think they need to bring to the table when being a part of different advisory groups? Anybody, Heather, Esther, Jill, whoever wants to jump in on this.
I can jump in if you like, get
Sure.
just things going. I think one of the things that's interesting right now is that there is a new dawn of board leadership. We've all heard the term ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and it's really coming home to roost. And what we're seeing right now is boards are very active in trying to understand what are the major directions and speed, to your point, Ali, that we're taking, and how are we executing this in a way that's going to protect the company, protect the people, and grow the culture. So right now, what's interesting from a board advisory capacity, you're going to start to see boards that are giving actual measurements to their CEO and to their management team on what kind of engagement scores do you have with your employees. Now, those scores, and Esther will know that this is done all the time in organizations where engagement is surveyed and such. But imagine if the CEO all of a sudden now is going to be rewarded and compensated on a higher engagement score. What gets measured gets done. I hate to sound corny and trite, but it's the truth. And so I think what we're going to see is a different set of standards that are going to be put on management. And then if you're on a board, if you are wanting to get on a board, then you too are going to have to do further development to kind of get up the curve on what are the kinds of questions that you want to start asking the management group about what is their vision, what is their strategy, have they done those scenarios like we talked about earlier. And so I think what we're seeing now is a new dawn. The other thing that's fascinating, and I was in a session, I don't know, a couple of months ago, and it was led by a woman who's done a lot of work on biomimicry. And those of you who have been following that story about how, in the organizational world, we start to look at the composition of nature and how those things flow back and forth. And one of the things that they started to find is that in the paradigm that we're in right now, it's starting to disintegrate. And what happens in a paradigm that's disintegrating, those of you who've been following rainforest and environmental disasters, what happens is that there has to be ways that we begin to form a new paradigm. Yeah. And so I think that's one of the big sort of uber themes that we're seeing right now in board advisory is that people are paying attention and absolutely judging how organizations are being portrayed on Glassdoor, what kind of reputation do they have out there. You have a lousy culture. Guess what? No one's, you're not going to get the brightest and the best to come work for you. They'll run for the hills and people are voting with their feet. So these are all the new kinds of levers and dashboards that I think we're going to see from a board advisory perspective. And it's going to flow both ways, Ali, in my view.
Absolutely. And while I would love to entertain more commentary on this, we have about 2.5 minutes left. And I want to be respectful of our other panelists, that is the City of Toronto, that are coming in next. So to our audience, I know I've missed out on a couple of questions. You can interact with Jill, Esther, and Heather on cyberexchange.ca. And if there's a demand for it, we'll certainly speak to the CyberX team and look at what future sessions could look like. Heather, let's go back to you, Esther, and then Jill. Heather, very quickly, a closing comment from you, maybe one word of advice or one feeling that you've had after engaging in this panel. And now from being an attendee to this year becoming a panelist at Women in Cyber, maybe a closing comment from you. Heather?
Ali, it's been such a pleasure talking today about all of these key issues. I think one area that we just didn't get a chance to tap into that I think is important is that we certainly want to make sure that we're building an ecosystem around diversity and inclusion. Absolutely. And so for everybody out there, organizations, there's certainly an expectation that we're driving, championing diversity and gender parity. And on the other hand as well, for individuals, be ready for these questions in the interviews. Think about what you're doing to embed diversity in your organization. It certainly speaks to, the era as well of being an emotionally intelligent leader. Are you intuitive? Do you have empathy? Are you a role model with integrity? And as you mentioned, Ali, do you have a pulse of how your team's feeling? So I think that it's a nice wrap up on the things that really stood out for me here today.
I would agree with you, and we are successful not in spite of our diversity, but because of it. And that's a governing tenet that we need to embrace. Esther, very quick, a closing comment from you. Thank you also for joining. Esther, over to you.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say to the women at this conference is make sure you manage your own career. So keep an eye on what you want to learn, how you want to grow, what you want to do. Be open to suggestions from managers and mentors, but don't stay in a job that you don't enjoy and where you're not learning just to be a, quote unquote, good corporate citizen. Look after your organization and look after yourself and your career.
Couldn't agree with you more, and that's been a mantra that we follow at the Cyber Exchange platform, which is people, process, and technology. And you've really emphasized on the people piece, and Esther, by example, that too. So thank you so much for your participation. Jill, closing comments over to you.
All I can say, be bold, be compassionate, be innovative, and please do everything that you can to make sure that this world is going to be a better place for all of us. From no matter where you are working around the world, you have the ability to make a difference. We got together, we're stronger together, we're all leading all the time.
Thank you so much for that. So Heather, Esther, and Jill, I'm going to ask you to stay on so that we can just have some debrief in the green room. But to our audience, in the next 30 minutes, well, for the next 30 minutes, you're going to enjoy some really cool advertising and graphics from the team from CyberX. You can enjoy some networking. Next up is the city of Toronto. In summary, I'll tell you, besides learning a heck of a lot, I will say this, is that when you're thinking about the good, the bad, and the ugly in hiring, specifically during COVID-19, this is not set in stone. And as you've often heard me say, it's set in jello. It's constantly going to be moving. So I do invite you to follow the Phelps Group on Twitter, on different angles of social media, and also go to their website, especially phelpscybersecurity.com. Fill out that contact form. Start getting in touch with them, because they're definitely going to keep you at the cutting edge of that jello in which this hiring world is now set in. To the ladies on board, Heather, Esther, Jill, once more, thank you so much. Happy International Women's Day to everybody, and I hope to see you at 2:30 with the City of Toronto, a session moderated by the CISO from the City of Toronto, Kush Sharma. Thank you all. Stay safe, stay healthy.